Mohan, the GER is increasing, which is a good sign. But the industry associations say that a very small percentage of the population, maybe 25%, are employable. So, what is it that we need to tweak to see that more get employment?
You know, they've been making that statement because there's a gap between what the academic institution teach and what industry wants. The gap has been a big one for a long period of time, basically because there is no interaction between the two, very less interaction. And industry has had surplus people. So when they had surplus people, they could hire the best and pay them peanuts. Now, after the IT industry came, the top 10% of the best schools always go to IT, right? So they're not getting them. So they have to now spend more money on training. I think the solution for that is industry should be incentivized to have massive training schemes and train a lot more people than they do with the public support from the government through incentives. Once they're able to do that, then possibly this problem will go away. And also second, with the new education policy, vocational education is going to be part of the education process. But to change a system which has 37 million young people in college, change a system which possibly has maybe 10 million teachers, correct? I'm sorry, 1 million teachers, and train them and bring it up is a humongous task. It's not going to happen fast. It's going to take a lot of time. But the IT industry spends $3 billion a year on training its workforce. They hire 200,000 people a year, or maybe 250,000 people, and they train them. And so the construction industry to train people. So I think we need to have a massive training program done through industry. The current program where you hire training companies to train them and try to place them is not working because they need on-the-job training. And on-the-job training can only come with large employers. So the apprenticeship program should expand. It is expanding, but it should be expanded much more. But that requires public funding and incentives. That's what we need to do.
Okay, but is this the reason why large corporate houses have now come into universities, schools, education, so that they may better fit into the system?
Yeah, they come there because they want to get a better finished product than what they get. So I think, that's a continuing trend. But when job opportunities increase because of higher growth, see, at the end of the day, it's all a matter of growth. If you're able to grow at 8 to 9% for 10 years, we'll produce double the jobs that we produce right now. Yeah. And there'll be enough resources. Mm-hmm. And to do that, we have to invest more. We're just investing 30% of GDP. We've got to take it up to 35, 40%. And for that purpose, we require more capital. We need at least about 3 to 4% FDI coming in. Right now, it's about around 2%. So we need 3 to 4%. So we need more capital because remember, India is a supply constrained country, not a demand constrained country, but supply at a price. And China demonstrated the last 20 years, the supply of basic goods and commodities at a reasonable price can expand the market and the buying power of people because people's income will not go up the same pace as economic growth. Otherwise, there'll be higher inflation, right? There's productivity, you pay for productivity and etc. So I think, and there's automation. So, jobs are going to be lost. So I think it's very important to review up growth. Growth is the only solace to get higher amount of jobs. And that's what happened in Trump's America. That's what happened in Trump's America. And that's what happened in the growth areas of growth years of Japan, Korea, China. That's what happened in China, growth. China grew 9.5% a year for some 35 years.
Nisha, since you are a researcher, how do you see Indian research per se vis-a-vis the Western countries?
So I've had the opportunity to conduct research both in India and the US, and there is a step function difference between what we have in India and what we have in the US. This is primarily because, and this comes back to our previous discussion point, this interaction between the academia and industry. In India, it's not as strong. And so the research laboratories and the environments for research are not as clued into what the industry needs and what the economy needs. And that has put research in a back step in India. Whereas if you go to any lab in the United States, they get massive government funding. They have access to the most state-of-the-art equipment, state-of-the-art technologies to conduct research. And then they have massive industry collaboration. So the industry says, this is where we envisage the industry going in 20 years. We want a technology that can help us do that in 20 years. So they're solving for problems that they foresee 20, 30 years down the line. Whereas in India, we're solving for problems that we're seeing today, which might not be relevant in about 4-5 years. And so that is the gap, I think, between Indian research and US research. Now, there are pockets of research in India that are cutting edge, that are world class. We have some facilities here at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, the nanotech facility and others that are world class. We have the National Center for Biological Sciences, NCBS, where there's some cutting edge research going on. So there are pockets of small pockets of research going on in India that is world class, that are collaborating with other institutions of their caliber across the world, that are talking to industry and are also talking to startup entrepreneurs of today that are focusing on problems that are going to be relevant 20, 30 years down the line. But in general, India's research caliber needs to come up as a whole. And I think that's where this, the point that the National Education Policy 2020 brings about the National Research Foundation is going to be very crucial, because we need funding. We need funding for early stage, high risk research in a number of areas. And this is where the Department of Biotechnology under the Government of India has been doing a stellar job over the last 10 years. DBT has set up various grant system, some incubators with world-class facilities like CCamp, where I work, and other places where they're supporting early stage, high risk research. And now we need to see that expand into growth stage and late stage research as well, where the government comes in and underwrites this risky research so that more entrepreneurs and researchers are willing to stake their careers, spend time in those laboratories and get the job done. That's where we'll see Indian research really blossom with that support from the government.
But how do you explain that we are not able to think 4 years ahead, whereas they are thinking 25 years ahead? Is there something wrong with our thought process?
No, I don't think. I think all these years we were sort of reacting to the circumstances. You know, we were a poorer country. We were reacting to the fact that we had all these millions of people who needed food. So we had very focused problems: remove malnutrition, for example, improve literacy, improve our education system. But now we've come to the point where these problems are starting to go away. Especially over the last 6 years, I think the NDA government has done a tremendous job with digital inclusion, financial inclusion, with education, and just providing for the basic necessities of people, right? So we've seen massive housing programs, the Ujjwala scheme that has been given gas cylinders to poor people. So in the rural areas, they're seeing a lot of development come in. They're seeing rural road connectivity improve. So many of these people, for the first time in their lives, they're seeing development come to their doorstep. And now the mindset of India is changing, where we've only been reacting to problems, but now we're looking at ourselves and saying, okay, we are now the 5th largest economy in the world. We overtook the UK a couple of years ago. We're looking at a growth trajectory, of course, pre-COVID, and now we'll have to start looking at what the effects of COVID are. But we were looking at a growth trajectory where we were asking the question, can we reach $5 trillion by 2025 and then $10 trillion by 2030? And if we do that, and when we do that, we will only be the 3rd economy in the world to have reached $10 trillion. And that is changing the mindset now to say, okay, where is India going to be in 10 years? Now, can we start solving for that? Can we start building the technology platforms that will help us get to 10 trillion? Can we start building the research platforms that will help us get to 20 trillion? And so that mindset change was necessary. It is happening. The churn is happening. And we're seeing that at all levels. We're seeing startup entrepreneurs, people who are giving up 20-year careers in multinational corporations, start their own companies because they're saying, I can build for India what no one else can. We're seeing this mindset change in the government agencies, who all this while were reacting to things, but now now, for example, DBT has all these scientists that they're recruiting who are saying, okay, research and development needs to be going in that direction. So again, mindset change. We're seeing the mindset change in the minds of regulators, who all this while were looking at Indian products coming in and saying, no, this is not the quality we want to regulate. But suddenly, because of COVID, regulators have expanded their scope to see all these COVID deployment innovations come in to help solve problems that no other country could help us, because everyone was in the same boat. So again, this mindset change was required. It's happening now. It's accelerated because of COVID. And I think the next decade is going to change a lot of things in our research mindset, our technology mindset, and our innovation mindset.
I want to add something. You asked the question, why didn't it happen in the past? There were 2 reasons: bad policy and a mindset issue of socialism, which had suspicion of the private sector. look at the best countries which are such on a sustained basis created great, research. There's a public-private participation because there is public funding, public institution, but public institutions partner with the private institutions for research because the impact of the public spending should be felt in the private area. Because if you look at DRDO for defense, it is very good. If you look at ISRO for space, it is very good. BRC for atomic energy is pretty good. They're world class. They've done extremely good work. But the point is, how much of the technology they've generated has gone into the private sector to make things much, much better. We're still not able to make a aeronautical engine, even though in 1947, we had one of the largest aeronautical industries in the world. So we're not able to do it. Why is that? Because government spends the public sector, but the benefit of that doesn't come to the private sector because they're suspicious of the private sector. They have this socialistic mindset that they will take money from the private sector, taxpayers as our taxers, but fund only the public sector. Even in academic area, most of the research funding goes to public universities, not to private universities. There is blatant discrimination against that. Now the Modi government has reversed that because you've seen in defense where they want Indian companies to come and manufacture all that. And that means the technologies of defense will go into the private sector and make them much, much better. They have this funding program for universities where there'll be no discrimination, but in public and funding. And ISRO has been asked to work with private sector and focus on pure technology. And all the launch vehicles will be made by the private sector. And even in defense, the same thing is happening. And I think DRDO is also working on that to make sure there's corporatization of the ordnance factories in defense. I think these are all significant steps which will remake India and solve this problem.
Yes, yes, this has been happening for a while now. Air India bleeding, hotels bleeding, government hotels bleeding. Unless all areas the government cannot administer, that they have realized now, and it's a more vibrant economy with everybody performing. The government needs to do governance and not running hotels. Probably they were not doing it well also. So anyway, one issue that Nisha has raised is the COVID thing. Now, let's come to the COVID thing. It has been seen that there is a shake-up. The developed countries have been more affected than the developing countries. This is in terms of the even GDP and the rest of the factors. Now, what we are seeing now is India was looking at the economy very positively in the beginning stages, unless, yes, we had a population issue when this was supposed to grow up, but we had controlled it very well in the beginning. And that was a case study for the world itself. Having said that, how is it that in this COVID situation, post maybe let's say 6 months, we come out in all areas? Maybe the education is affected, the economy is affected, the employment is affected. What is it that we need to do to get out of this? And this is particularly for India.
Well, let me start off that Disha can add. We came with a very stringent lockdown in the month of March that stopped the COVID from spreading. And, there was fear people will drop dead, millions will get infected. Nobody knew what to do. And slowly in May and June, we started opening up. And we had this migrant crisis where politically people tried to push the migrants out to create a crisis. It was a man-made crisis in the beginning. Then it became a large number of people went out. Maybe 10 million people went back to the villages because they were not able to get food. And the Supreme Court later said that the state governments have to give them food and succor, which they failed to do. And it will happen. We are a political economy and a lot of things happen. Now, our economy shrank by 24% in April, May, June. Now in July, economy was better than June. August was much better than July. And September, there's been actual growth compared to September of last year. So this quarter, we may shrink by maybe 8 to 10%. I foresee next quarter, there'll be positive growth of maybe 3 to 4% because the festival season. And the quarter of that, we could go up to 5 to 6% if it continues. So the whole year, we could end up between 5 to 7% decline in growth. But suddenly, we are past the worst, and I think we'll go up. So we must accept that this is a break year. We must all think there's a break here. And, like a non-planned holiday, planned holiday we used to have, remember one point of time in the planning era, take it as a break here and then go on, but do all the reforms and everything that's required so that when we come out of this hole, we are in a much better shape. And the last 4 months, the kind of reforms that have happened, labor reforms, agricultural reforms, and investment in farm gate infrastructure, defense reforms and everything else has been unbelievable. And banking reforms too. I think they've been unbelievable. And all this is going to make sure that we become leaner, we become more competitive, we become much better. And the private sector, there has been a realization that you got to be competitive. You got to cut your costs and you got to export. That's why we saw a massive export of Indian steel in the first quarter of this year. And that is continuing, even though the rates are much, much better here. And we had the Atmanirbhar program where we want to be self-reliant. And India has taken on China. In the last 10 years, the biggest factor in India's trade was in China, which we had a trade hole of $500 billion. China never opened its market to us. China had non-tariff barriers, and China made sure the state-owned enterprises subsidized that they could dump goods here, and we kept quiet. Now, Prime Minister Modi has taken a tough stand. Of course, we have some border issues, some political issues, but with this program, government is coming out with the right thing to incentivize industry to fill the breach, to become more competitive. Earlier, they had a policy measure with no incentives. And this incentive has worked very well. For example, India last year made about 225 million mobile phones and exported $5 billion. This year, we could be exporting $6 to $7 billion. We're second largest manufacturer of mobile phones. Even though value addition is around 25%, you go to 30, 40%. Now they have a new program to increase value addition. They're having programs in drugs, in many other industries. Nisha, you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at March, when we got a sense of how big this coronavirus pandemic was going to be and what the effect was going to be, we realized that India's dependence on global supply chains was tremendous. We had no indigenous manufacturing of PPE, of diagnostic kits, and many essential items that we needed to fight the pandemic. And just in 2-3 months, we were able to ramp up the supply of all of this equipment.
Including
and now we
ventilators.
And ventilators, yes, ventilators, respiratory aids. Just we were at complete reliance on the global supply chain, and now we're at complete self-reliance. In fact, we're at near export surplus volumes. And so this shows the ingenuity of the Indian, both the private sector and the government sector, to be able to come together and solve problems like this. And that's why this impetus on Atmanirbhar Bharat is so important to start at this time, because we have seen what is possible if all of us come together and start working on indigenous technologies, indigenous deployment, and indigenous development. And that impetus needs to continue. And that's why this Atmanirbhar Bharat reforms are so important at this point. And I think going forward, to come out of this fiscal year 2021 hole that coronavirus has put us into, I think investment is going to be extremely important from the government side. Now, everyone's, asking us to, we want to boycott China. We want to move away from dependence on China. But the economies are so inextricably joined that this is going to take some time. And one of the biggest differences we see coming out of goods from China and goods from India is the supply chain costs in China are so minimal. It's about 6% of GDP. US is at 5%, whereas India is at about 14% of GDP supply chain costs. And that's quite inefficient. Of course, with GST and the infrastructure projects that have been going on for the last 6 years, this has improved. But there is a massive scope to increase it, to decrease it further. From 14%, we have to come down to about 6 or 5%. And so investment in infrastructure is going to be very important. Investment in our industrial clusters so that we're able to start labor-intensive and specialized manufacturing to be able to compete with China. Investment in roads and ports and railways to improve the speed of carriage of goods from the industry clusters to the ports. Port development is going to be very important. We have to look at improving our ports both on the east and western coasts. For example, we have some very good ports in Mangalore and Bombay and all these places, which have immediate access to the Suez Canal from that region. And so that gives us access to export markets in Africa, export markets in Europe, and even the east coast of the USA. So we have to start taking advantage of these, the geographical proximities to these areas, to our infrastructure development and others, and start fast tracking some of these projects like the dedicated freight corridors, the development of river systems. Like, for example, Germany has done with its Rhine river system. They use it as a cargo system. So we have to start asking questions. What can we do to improve supply chain costs? What can we do to improve competitiveness? Given that we were able to achieve so much in the 3 months of COVID, we should be able to use that to really not just build self-reliant India, but to improve our innovation, to improve our technology development, and then start exporting all of this to the world. Today, we are very focused on our small $3 trillion economy, whereas the global market, of course, pre-COVID was 82 trillion. And so that gives us a 28x expansion if we start looking at export markets. And that's where India needs to start, what India needs to start doing. And I think COVID has given us a good, hard look at what that path could look like.
Mohan, the fact that you had said that a lot of laborers had migrated back to their hometowns or villages. And now post-COVID, do they come back? How does this affect the economy?
Well, my view is maybe 25, 30, 40% will stay back, will not go back.
Okay.
Because, they have discovered that in the big cities, they were paid peanuts. In the crisis, they never got money. They barely made money. They stayed in very bad circumstances. Now, when they gone back to the villages, they find that many of them have houses. Villages are developed. There is water, there is sewage, there are toilets, there are many good things. And there is DBT, there's a work program. And many of them may say that, look, I've got the skills here and I can work. Prime Minister Modi made a very interesting observation. He said in Madhya Pradesh, when he inaugurated 200,000 houses under the housing program, he said houses are now being built in 45 to 50 days because the migrants have come back. So those places had a skill deficit. Now all the skilled people have gone back, construction workers, people who used to trade, etc. They've gone back. They bring enormous amount of skills, and those skills are going to impact positively. What is required is a massive program of employment generation and a massive program of infrastructure in those areas, which is working. Yogi Adityanath said UP is having massive road building programs, and they don't have people. Now all the people who went back will get employment there. And I think companies are coming there investing. So I think this actually is a big boon. And in the south, south in the big cities like Delhi, people are finding that people have to be valued. Earlier, they should treat them shabbily, pay them very less money, not treat them well. Now they're saying, no, people, you better pay them better. I hope the wages go up in the big cities like Bangalore, Bombay, and Delhi for the kind of work that people are doing, and wages don't remain depressed. And lesser people come because there are opportunities in Bihar, in Madhya Pradesh, in Uttar Pradesh, and in Rajasthan, etc. And if that happens, it reverses, wages will go up here, and the people who come as migrants will have better wages. And we will pay the true cost of labor instead of getting subsidized by labor because we exploit them because there are too many of them. So I think it's very important that this kind of a mix come. But the trigger will be greater investment in those states. And I think we see that happening. Prime Minister Modi has seen that, and I think they're doing it very well.
Yes.
In fact, to add to that, what's going to be very important is entrepreneurship drives in these places where the migrants have gone back. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, they've seen so many people come back with skills, right? They've worked in the construction industry, they've worked in big manufacturing plants, they've seen end-to-end manufacturing, they've been a part of it. And so they have an idea now of what's possible to build, which they didn't have 10 years ago when they were in their villages. So now they can envision these big factories being built near their villages. And hopefully, even if 20% of them have the drive to build those factories now because they've gotten those skills, they've seen how it works, and they can now avail schemes through the Mudra scheme and other entrepreneurship drives that the government has made and start building those factories back in their hometowns, it could transform these 5-6 states from where labor has been migrating over the last 10 years. So that is going to be very crucial, the entrepreneurship drives, in addition to the industry and employment drives.
So the last point that I want to talk about, which is a part of the UN SDGs, is the mental health and well-being. Now, I want to put this into perspective that children doing online education these days during COVID, how difficult will it be to wean them into normal going to school kind of education after they are addicted to their mobiles or digital devices?
Look, my personal view is children are raring to go out.
Yeah.
They want to meet other children. They don't like virtual kids. They may be addicted, but I think they will all go out. Parents will push them out because parents don't want in the house anymore. Everybody is fed up of being confined in the house. Because remember, not everybody has got a large house. In a very small house, 4 or 5 people are confined, and it is terrible. So I think they all want the kids to go as soon as it becomes safe. So I don't think it's going to be a very big problem. I mean, the problem will be there because people are recognizing it now because they've been confined in the house. And since they're confined in the house, human beings don't get companionship, they don't get other people, so they have a problem. But I think the problem is now been seen, and there are many, many people coming up to help them. Counselors are coming up, government is doing something. So I think it will become less of a problem, but there'll be greater focus on mental health. There'll be greater focus on mental health. And I think the key for everybody to understand is that you got to take care of yourself. And you got to learn how to be positive. There are many, many techniques to use, etc. And they'll only know that if they've got peers and they interact with people. The human interaction is what is missing. And once that comes, this will become a lesser problem than it is today. And hopefully, I think we'll see something. But recognizing this problem is a good start. Nisha?
Okay, Nisha.
No, I agree. I think the pandemic has exposed different facets of our health, and we've all started to understand that it's not just physical health that we have to pay attention to. It's mental health as well. It's the mental health of the doctors, mental health of the patients who had COVID and had to undergo hospitalization. It's the mental health of all these people who had been locked down and were unable to go out. And so I think everyone has started to understand that. The government is starting to understand that. And one thing that's come out of all this digital entertainment, see, so far, there's data that shows that the average Indian consumes 11 GB of data per month. That's a lot of data. And so far, I would presume that we've been looking at entertainment and other non-educational content, right? But now, because of COVID, there is an impetus on looking at educational content as part of that 11 GB per month. And that is a welcome move. And so now we have all these companies like Byju's and UABL and these companies that are building good learning outcomes out of digital content. And I think that is going to be very positive, even for mental health, because we're now starting to envision new ways of content delivery, new ways of accepting content. And that, I think, might change the mindset from just looking at entertainment all day to learning something once in a while.
Mohan, but this brings me to the point that if there is a greater digital divide between the haves and have-nots, how do this online thing happen with the village children?
Well, I think there is a greater digital divide. Yes, I think people recognize that, and we need the government to spend money. And I would urge the government to spend money to give a good tablet to young children with preloaded software for class education. It'll make a dramatic improvement in the digital literacy and bring them on par with everybody else. Government has to invest. I don't think it's a large investment. It'll be just maybe $20–25 billion. Not very large. You can do it easily over the next 2 years. We need an enlightened government to do that, because in many states, including my state, government is stopping private sector from doing digital education because they say rural kids cannot do it, so you cannot do it. It's ridiculous that the attitude they have, because last section cannot do it, why should you do it? Oh, it is bad for you, don't do it. That's ridiculous. They should not do that. They must think, how can we help the rural kids? And I think the rural parents too have understood that, and they'll demand. And in the democracy, when citizens rise up and demand that we want this, things will happen. They got to restructure schools and go digital in the next 2 or 3 years. I'm sure Prime Minister Modi knows about it. We'll do something once the economic situation improves, because to me, bridging the digital divide is the most important thing. And second, the cost of smartphones is coming down dramatically. And today we hear that Jio, which is one of the largest player in telecom, wants to have maybe about 250 million smartphones to be done at a very low cost, right? Because their market will expand. And that also will help. So I think in another 2 or 3 years, we'll bridge a large part of the digital divide, because the broadband is gone to 160,000 villages out of 250,000 who need it. And we got 94–95% of the country covered by wireless. Nisha?
No, absolutely. In the first 5 years of the NDA government, they brought fiber optic connectivity to about 1.2 lakh gram panchayats. And so that the foundation for setting up, for reducing the digital divide, I think is already in place. Again, with India Stack and all the technologies that came out of India Stack with Jandan and everything, people are already acclimatized to going to the phone for all their needs, especially with COVID now, that everyone's going to their phone for everything. Of course, it's in urban centers more than rural areas, but people are using UPI to transact. People are getting e-commerce, even in the tier 2 and tier 3 towns now. And so we're starting to see that mindset change again of going to digital for your needs. And if the government can go in and just put some investment behind it, we're going to see a transformational India where reducing the digital divide is concerned.
As an end note, I have seen some self-help groups coming forward asking for your own mobile phones and distributing it to students who don't have so that they can have. We've also seen radio being used in a very fruitful way in villages. All India Radio has pitched in, the government has pitched in. We've also seen cinema halls being used for school children, show videos of life skills, etc. So we are an innovative lot. So if we find that a way out for any problem that we have, and that's very true. So thank you very much, both Nisha and
I just want to make one more point. Remember, India is a digital crucible for solutions for the 6.5 billion people who are outside the OECD. So our innovation in health tech, innovation in agri-tech, innovation in education technology, innovation in other areas can be used in those countries at extremely low cost. Our India Stack and all the financial industry can be used there because the costs are very low. They all become public utilities and they can scale up dramatically. So the world, the 6.5 billion people who are not in the OECD have a solution now, and I think they should start using it. And that maybe that's one of the messages you must take back to the UN, that we have a digital solution to dramatically impact positively the lives of people who are outside the OECD.
And crucially, now, normally all the technologies that have come in, digital technologies to these people outside the OECD, have either been by American for-profit companies or now by Chinese companies with state involvement. India is the only country that has built these digital technologies at scale within a private-public partnership. And that is what is crucial, because it's not a private company that's holding on to this data and monetizing it, or it's not a hegemonic country trying to, snoop on its citizens. It's for the citizens, by the citizens, and of the citizens. And that is that crucial difference that's going to make a difference to democratizing technology for this 6.5 billion people that are outside OECD. So India has come out with a very unique model, the digital public goods model, which the United Nations should definitely look at to improve the lot of other emerging economies and underdeveloped economies.
What we do is then, at the end, Mohan, what are the 3 things that you see that India will be leading in the world 25 years from now?
Technology.
1.
Artificial intelligence. Health. Because we will produce the largest number of doctors ever, and we have now got 88,000 young people entering medicine every single year. Technology and health, and we will be leaders in education. Education not for the OECD, but education for the 6.5 billion people, because we would have mastered the art of using digital content and the digital world to give very low-cost education to everybody. Nisha, what are your 3 things?
No, I agree. And I think it's the intersection of all of these things where India is really going to shine, because we have 18 official languages in India and 25,000 or 30,000 dialects. And so we are going to be able to use technology to deliver vernacular content that is customized to the child. And that can immediately be adopted by any country around the world to build their own systems, right? Same thing with health and tech. Now with COVID, we saw that there's a big gap in the healthcare infrastructure in the country. So we started using telemedicine and e-consulting at a rate that most other countries can't even imagine because of the scale we have here. So it's the scale that India has, the nearly 1.4 billion people that we have to innovate for, that automatically makes it so usable by the remaining 7 billion people. So it's these intersections of health and technology, education and technology, where India is really going to shine.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
From UN 75 for joining us and giving us your valuable time and inputs. We enjoyed it thoroughly. It could have gone on for another hour or so, but we have to stop here. Thank you very much, Mohan and Nisha.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good talking to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.